At dawn, when the fog still clung to the hedgerows like a guilty secret, the world of Harrington Court awakened already murmuring her name. It slipped from servant to servant, from footman to cook, from carriage driver to stable boy, each syllable softened by shock yet sharpened by judgment. By the time the sun rose pale and uncommitted above the estate, the story had taken its shape, and she had already been found wanting. She stood alone at the tall window of the east guest chamber, her reflection faint in the glass, her posture straight through habit rather than hope. Beyond the pane, dew silvered the lawns, and peacocks cried from the distant gardens, oblivious to the ruin unfolding among humans. The nightgown she wore was plain cotton, hastily buttoned, a garment never meant to be seen by daylight nor memory. Her hair, still rebellious from sleep, had been braided with trembling hands, as though order itself might yet be persuaded to return. Only hours earlier, she had crossed the great hall barefoot, her steps swallowed by the Aubusson rugs, her heart beating so fiercely she feared it might wake the portraits. Chandeliers had been dark, the revellers long retired, and the house held its breath as she passed. That image, somehow witnessed, now burned brighter in society's imagination than any truth she might offer. She was no longer a woman driven by urgency, but a spectacle constructed by whispers. By breakfast, the drawing-room filled without her. Teacups clinked too loudly. Gloved fingers lingered over folded invitations, already rescinded in thought. A lady she had once laughed with turned her face aside, as though sudden blindness were preferable to recognition. Respectability, that fragile illusion, withdrew its favor with ruthless efficiency. No accusation was spoken aloud, yet condemnation settled upon her shoulders like winter frost. Her name was Eleanor Whitcomb, daughter of a modest clergyman and niece to the family hosting the season's most anticipated gathering. She possessed neither fortune nor formidable connections, only a reputation for composure and a mind inclined toward honesty. It was this very inclination that had led her, heart-pounding, to the Duke of Ashbourne's door in the dead of night. Desperation, not desire, had propelled her hand to knock. Society, however, had never been interested in motive. The Duke himself was spoken of in careful tones, as though his title demanded reverence even in rumor. He was a figure of marble stillness in public, his expression measured, his dark eyes betraying nothing. Men deferred to him instinctively, and women observed him as one might a distant storm, magnificent and dangerous. He had arrived at Harrington Court with all the ceremony expected of his rank, yet kept himself aloof, attending dances with courtesy rather than appetite. What no one remarked upon, until it was too late, was the way his gaze had followed Eleanor in the ballroom the previous evening. Not with hunger, but with something quieter and more unsettling, as though he were witnessing a moment that would one day wound him. She, for her part, had felt that attention like a pressure between her shoulders, though she never once met his eyes. She had been too occupied with fear. That fear now sat beside her like an unwelcome companion. From the corridor beyond her door came the muffled echo of passing footsteps, hesitant, curious. She understood then that her disgrace was already complete. Even if the truth were shouted from the balconies, it would arrive too late to matter. Society loved a fall more than it loved fairness. When her aunt finally appeared, lips drawn tight and eyes glassy with restrained panic, Eleanor recognized the look. It was the expression worn by those calculating loss. Words were exchanged, careful and brittle, urging discretion, advising patience, suggesting retreat to the countryside. Not once was Eleanor asked what had happened, only whether she understood what must be done now. She listened, nodding when expected, her voice steady when she replied. Dignity, she had learned, was sometimes nothing more than silence worn proudly. Yet beneath that stillness, something shifted. Shame had come, as she knew it would, but it had not broken her. Instead, it clarified the cruelty of the rules she had tried so diligently to follow. As the morning advanced, a letter was delivered on heavy cream paper, sealed with dark wax. The crest upon it was unmistakable. Her fingers paused before breaking it, the room suddenly too small to contain her breath. Outside, a carriage rolled away from the court, carrying laughter and relief elsewhere. She folded the letter without reading it at once, pressing it against her chest as though it might steady the tremor there. Memories crowded in unbidden. Her father's sermons on moral courage, her mother's warnings about appearances, the countless small concessions she had made to remain unremarkable. All of it seemed suddenly irrelevant. Around her, the house resumed its ordinary rhythms, bells ringing, doors opening, lives continuing, indifferent to her private reckoning. Yet within Eleanor, a quiet resolve began to stir, fragile but unmistakable, like the first warmth beneath thawing ground. When at last she unfolded the letter, her hands were steady. She did not yet know whether its contents would wound or redeem her, only that retreat was no longer possible. Somewhere within the corridors of the estate, the Duke of Ashbourne was awake, aware of what the night had cost her. Whatever words he had chosen now waited, consequential. Eleanor lifted her gaze from the page, her future narrowing to a truth. The scandal had claimed her past, and the man who caused it would be forced to decide what he intended to do with her tomorrow. The days that followed did not explode with accusation, but crept forward with a more dangerous cruelty. Silence, Eleanor soon learned, possessed a sharper edge than outrage. It moved unseen, settled into corners, and allowed imaginations to grow monstrous where facts were absent. Harrington Court resumed its genteel routines, yet every courtesy offered to her was tinged with strain, every greeting delivered a fraction too late. She had become a presence to be managed rather than welcomed. No one spoke of the night outright. They spoke instead of weather, of horses, of distant relatives whose names carried no consequence. Yet pauses lingered after her name, and eyes tracked her passage through rooms with quiet calculation. It was understood that discretion was expected of her, that gratitude should accompany her continued shelter. Eleanor complied outwardly, though inwardly she felt herself diminishing beneath the weight of restraint. The Duke of Ashbourne remained conspicuously absent. His place at table was empty, his chair untouched, as though his presence alone might provoke the truth to surface. That absence unsettled her more than his company would have done. She wondered if he, too, had been advised to keep distance, or if withdrawal was his own choosing. The question pressed upon her thoughts with unwelcome intimacy. On the third morning, a small parcel arrived at the house, delivered by a footman who avoided her eyes. It bore no letter, only her name written in a firm, deliberate hand. Inside lay a slim volume bound in green leather, its edges worn as though often handled. She recognized it at once. It was a book she had once admired aloud in the library, remarking upon a passage concerning moral courage. The Duke had been present then, silent, listening. Her fingers tightened around the cover. The gift was modest, almost defensible, yet its meaning was unmistakable. He had remembered her words. He had acted. That alone was enough to unsettle the careful equilibrium she had been forced to maintain. She did not display the book, nor did she hide it. She placed it upon her bedside table, where it could accuse her equally of hope and foolishness. By afternoon, the parcel had been noticed. Whispers resumed with renewed vigor, now sharpened by implication. A gift suggested favor, favor suggested intimacy, intimacy confirmed every suspicion already entertained. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. Where she had been pitted before, she was now assessed. The narrative had evolved without her consent. Another token followed 2 days later. A carriage waited at the gates one evening, dark and unadorned, its driver bearing instructions to escort Miss Whitcomb wherever she wished. She declined, aware that acceptance would seal her reputation beyond recovery. The carriage departed, but not before being observed by several guests lingering deliberately near the windows. That night, she wept for the first time. Not from despair, but from the exhaustion of constant vigilance. Dignity, she discovered, demanded relentless effort. Every refusal cost her, every acceptance would cost her more. She existed now in a narrowing corridor of choices, each judged before taken. The Duke appeared at last during a morning walk, emerging from the mist along the garden path. He looked unchanged, impeccably composed, yet something in his expression tightened when he saw her. They halted several paces apart, propriety erect between them like a wall. He inclined his head, a gesture precise and laden. "I hope you are well, Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice low, measured. "I am," she replied, and surprised herself by meaning it only partially. Nothing more passed between them, yet the exchange rippled outward with consequence. By luncheon, it was known that he had spoken to her. By evening, it was rumored he had sought her favor openly. Silence, once again, transformed observation into scandal. That night, Eleanor stood by her window, the book open in her hands, the garden below washed in moonlight. The Duke's restraint had not protected her, his kindness had imperiled her further. Yet beneath the fear stirred something dangerous and bright. If silence could destroy her so completely, she began to wonder what truth, finally spoken, might yet claim. The summons came without ceremony, delivered by a maid whose eyes betrayed both curiosity and pity. Eleanor was asked to attend the Duke of Ashbourne in the West Library after dusk, a request phrased as courtesy yet weighted with inevitability. She accepted with a nod, aware that refusal would only extend the torment. As twilight bled into shadow, she dressed plainly, choosing restraint as armor, and followed the silent corridors toward whatever truth awaited her. The library was warmed by a single hearth, firelight breathing against shelves of venerable books. Shadows climbed the walls like attentive witnesses. The Duke stood near the mantel, hands clasped behind his back, his profile carved by flickering gold. He turned at her entrance, and for the first time since that disastrous night, allowed emotion to surface. Relief, remorse, resolve, all passed across his features before discipline reclaimed them. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, bowing with deliberate care, "thank you for coming." "I would not have declined," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Too much has been left unsaid." He gestured toward a chair, though she remained standing, unwilling to accept comfort she had not earned. The silence between them thickened, filled with crackling embers and unasked questions. At last, she spoke, compelled by a courage born of exhaustion. "You sent gifts," she said. "You spoke to me publicly. Each kindness has sharpened the blade already poised at my back." His gaze did not waver. "I know. And yet I could not remain idle while you bore the weight of a misjudgment that was not of your making." Her breath caught. "Then you understand how that night has been twisted." "I understand it better than anyone," he answered quietly. "You came to me seeking protection, not favor. You were desperate, not daring." The words loosened something within her chest. Firelight shimmered in her eyes, though she refused tears. "And still you allowed them to believe otherwise." "I allowed them nothing," he said, stepping closer. "I believed silence would preserve you. I was wrong." The admission struck deeper than apology. Eleanor studied him then, truly seeing the man beyond the title. He was not untouched by consequence. He was merely accustomed to surviving it. The difference lay in what survival demanded of her. "I asked for nothing more than discretion," she said. "Yet discretion has devoured me." His jaw tightened. "Tell me why you came that night." She hesitated only a moment. "Because I had overheard a conversation meant to remain secret. One that threatened to ruin an innocent man and bind you unknowingly to a lie. I believed you deserved the truth, regardless of the cost to myself." Understanding dawned, slow and devastating. "You sacrificed your reputation," he said, "to preserve my honor." "I did not think of it so grandly," Eleanor replied. "I thought only that remaining silent would be a greater wrong." The Duke exhaled, a sound heavy with recognition. "In all my years, no one has trusted me so fully, nor risked so much in doing so." Their proximity now was undeniable. The fire cast their shadows together upon the rug, indistinguishable. Eleanor felt the pull of something dangerous, a connection forged not by desire alone, but by shared truth. "I am not free to act as I wish," he continued. "My title is not my own. Every choice echoes through families, estates, histories." She nodded. "I have never presumed otherwise. And yet," he said, voice dropping, "I find that I cannot undo what has begun." Her pulse raced. "Nor can I," she admitted, the words escaping before caution could restrain them. For a moment, the world narrowed to firelight and breath. He reached out, stopping short of touching her hand, restraint trembling. "If I speak, truly speak, I will be forced to claim what society already assumes." "And if you do not," Eleanor said softly, "I will continue to fade." The choice hung between them, terrible and luminous. He lowered his hand, as though the weight of it were unbearable. "I will not let you disappear." The promise settled like an oath. Eleanor straightened, something within her igniting. "Then understand this, your grace. I will not be protected in shadows. Whatever is done must be done in the open." He met her gaze, something fierce and tender warring within his eyes. "So be it." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows, as though the world itself sensed a shift. Eleanor turned toward the door, her steps lighter than when she had entered. Behind her, the Duke watched, knowing that truth, once invited, would demand everything. By morning, their silence would end, and neither would emerge unchanged. She paused at the threshold, hand resting briefly against the carved wood, feeling the gravity of what lay ahead. The corridor beyond seemed longer than before, as though the house itself anticipated upheaval. She did not look back, trusting that he would keep his word without witness. In the solitude of the library, the Duke remained motionless, confronting a truth he could neither delegate nor escape. He understood now that rank offered no shelter from conscience, and that love, once awakened, demanded courage equal to any battlefield. The fire dwindled, embers collapsing inward, mirroring the end of his former certainties. Somewhere in the upper chambers, Eleanor would soon lie awake, rehearsing tomorrow's consequences, aware that confession had shifted her from victim to participant in fate. Neither could predict how society would respond, only that its judgment would be swift. Yet beneath the dread stirred an unspoken certainty, fragile but insistent, that honesty, once chosen, carried its own defiant grace. It was a grace neither had sought, yet both now claimed, bound together by a night that refused to remain a secret, and by a dawn approaching with unforgiving clarity. Tomorrow would ask them to stand, not as roomer and protector, but as equals before the watching world. And neither yet understood how irrevocably that world was about to change. Forever altered. The evening announced itself with cruel splendor. Harrington Court blazed with light as though determined to banish every shadow that had lingered in its corridors for days. Carriages arrived in an unbroken procession, wheels hissing against gravel, lanterns swaying like impatient hearts. Silk whispered, jewels caught candlelight, and laughter rose deliberately loud, determined to prove that nothing had truly been disturbed. Yet beneath the glitter, tension lay coiled, waiting. Eleanor entered without escort. Her gown was modest but impeccably cut, pale fabric falling with disciplined grace. She wore no ornament save a simple ribbon at her throat, a quiet defiance against expectation. Conversations faltered as she passed. Fans paused mid-flutter, and glances followed her progress with open astonishment. She felt the weight of them, but did not falter. Tonight, she had resolved, she would not shrink. Across the room, the Duke of Ashbourne stood among a circle of distinguished guests, his bearing as composed as ever. Yet his attention was elsewhere. The moment Eleanor crossed the threshold, his focus fixed upon her, unyielding. He excused himself with polite brevity and moved forward, each step measured, irrevocable. The space between them closed under 100 watching eyes. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, offering his arm. The gesture struck like a bell. Silence rippled outward, broken only by a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her. Eleanor hesitated, not from fear, but from understanding the cost. Accepting him would ignite scandal anew. Refusing him would condemn them both to separate erasures. She placed her gloved hand upon his sleeve. They walked together into the heart of the room. Whispers surged, urgent and unrestrained. The Duke halted near the dais, where hosts customarily addressed their guests. He turned to face the assembly, his posture straightening as though bracing against an invisible storm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm, resonant, impossible to ignore. "I am aware that my actions may invite speculation. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise." Murmurs answered him. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, yet she did not withdraw her hand. His steadiness anchored her. "It has been suggested," he continued, "that Miss Whitcomb's character requires defense. I offer it now, not as obligation, but as truth." The room held its breath. "She came to me in confidence," he said, "driven by conscience and courage, to prevent an injustice. That her honor has been questioned as a result is an offense I will not permit to stand." Gasps followed, sharp and disbelieving. Eleanor's chest tightened, emotion threatening to undo her composure. No one had ever spoken her name so publicly, so deliberately. I alone bear responsibility for failing to shield her from misinterpretation, the Duke said. And I now correct that failure. He turned to her then, his voice softening, meant only for her ears though all strained to hear. Miss Whitcomb, I ask you to stand with me, not in silence, but openly as my equal. The words settled over her like warmth after winter. She lifted her chin. I stand, she replied, her voice clear, because truth requires no hiding. The reaction was immediate. Some faces hardened, others softened, alliances forming and fracturing in real time. Eleanor sensed her former world slipping away even as something new pressed forward, unfamiliar and bright. Music resumed hesitantly, as though unsure of its welcome. The Duke did not release her arm. Together, they moved, not dancing, but remaining visible, undeniable. Each step they took rewrote the narrative others had tried to impose. Later, as the evening thinned and guests departed with hurried farewells, Eleanor found herself standing beside him beneath the towering windows. Outside, night gathered once more, quieter now. You have changed everything, she said. He regarded her with solemn intensity. No, we have. Her breath caught at the shared claim. In that moment, she understood the full measure of what had been lost and gained. Reputation could be rebuilt or abandoned. Integrity, once claimed, endured. As the final carriage departed, leaving echoes and uncertainty behind, the Duke offered his arm again, this time without audience. Eleanor accepted, aware that tomorrow would bring consequences neither could yet foresee. Still, as they stood together in the fading light, she felt no regret. Society had witnessed their defiance. Now it would decide whether to condemn or follow. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale and deliberate, as though the world itself wished to appear unchanged. Harrington Court stood quiet beneath a washed sky, its windows reflecting nothing of the turmoil it had hosted. Yet within its walls, consequence stirred. Eleanor woke with the strange clarity that follows irrevocable choice. The night's defiance had not faded into dream. It pressed upon her chest with equal parts dread and resolve. By midday, the reckoning began. Letters arrived bearing crests both familiar and forbidding. Some were brief and formal, withdrawing association with regret carefully phrased as propriety. Others were longer, laden with cautious approval, relief disguised as moral reflection. Eleanor read each without flinching. She had expected abandonment. What surprised her was how little it wounded now. The Duke of Ashbourne did not shield himself behind silence. He received visitors in his study, answered questions with precision, and refused to retreat from the position he had claimed. Word spread swiftly that he had declined a proposed alliance advantageous beyond measure, dismissing it with a single sentence that echoed through drawing rooms like thunder. He would not barter truth for comfort. The declaration unsettled the order of things. Eleanor saw him that afternoon in the garden, where autumn had begun its quiet work. Leaves loosened from branches, drifting earthward without struggle. He approached her openly, unaccompanied, as though daring the world to object. Servants watched from windows. None intervened. "It has begun," she said. "Yes," he replied. "And it will not be gentle." She considered him then, the man stripped of illusion, standing not as Duke but as himself. "Do you regret it?" He answered without hesitation. "Not once." The simplicity of it stole her breath. She had imagined courage as something loud, dramatic. Instead, it stood before her in restraint and consistency, in a refusal to bend when bending would ease everything. Days passed. The season fractured. Invitations shifted hands. Certain doors closed forever, others opened unexpectedly. Eleanor's name, once spoken with pity, began to be paired with admiration, then curiosity, then respect. Not universally. Never universally. Yet enough to matter. One evening, as dusk settled into amber and smoke curled from distant chimneys, the Duke brought her to the long gallery. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, faces stern and unsympathetic. He stopped before one in particular, a woman rendered in dark silk, her gaze unyielding. "She was my great-grandmother," he said. "She defied her family to marry for love. History remembers her as difficult." Eleanor smiled faintly. "History is rarely kind to women who refuse silence." "Nor to men who choose them," he said. Then, after a breath, "I have considered what I am willing to lose." Her heart stilled. "And my title will endure," he said. "My wealth may diminish. My influence will alter. What I will not lose is the certainty that I stood where I ought." She faced him fully. "And what of me?" He reached for her hands, unloved now, his touch steady. "I offer you a life not free of scrutiny, but free of apology. I offer you my name, knowing it may cost us both." Emotion rose swift and fierce. "I have already paid dearly," she said. "I will not be owned as recompense." He bowed his head. "Then choose me only if you wish." The gallery seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor felt the weight of generations pressing inward, demanding conformity. She also felt, unmistakably, the quiet power of choosing herself. "I do wish," she said. The words altered everything. Not dramatically, but irrevocably. They were married quietly before winter took full hold, with only a handful of witnesses who understood the cost of attendance. There was no spectacle, no attempt to persuade society with grandeur. Their union stood on its own merit, unadorned and unapologetic. Years later, Harrington Court would be spoken of less for scandal than for what followed. Eleanor became known not as the woman who dared too much, but as the duchess who listened fiercely and spoke sparingly, whose presence altered rooms without demanding them. The duke, softened and sharpened by love, governed his estates with uncommon equity. They were not universally adored. They were remembered. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Eleanor would walk the gardens alone, recalling the night she had crossed marble floors in a nightgown, armed only with truth. The memory no longer stung. It glowed. History would reduce it, as it always did, to rumor and footnote. A whisper of impropriety. A murmur of defiance. Yet beneath those whispers lived a simpler truth. A woman had refused to disappear. A man had refused to let her. And in that refusal, they had rewritten what love could cost, and what it could save, leaving behind a legacy not shouted, but enduring, like a flame sheltered from the wind, burning on long after witnesses turned away.